Indigenous peoples can increase their ability to access funds for investment purposes, especially when it comes to owning businesses, starting new businesses, or producing art. But the question is how? We recently got a chance to chat with Susan Anzolin, Special Advisor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Office of the President at the Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario. As a Director General, Susan worked with businesses across Southern Ontario to be more innovative, productive, and to help scale up efforts, support community development and diversification, support companies impacted by COVID-19 through the delivery of the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund. Susan was also responsible for all of the programming delivered by the agency to support inclusive growth, including the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy, the Black Entrepreneurship Programs, and the Economic Development Initiative. In this podcast, Susan shared the knowledge of some programs and business development offerings FedDev has in place for the growth of Indigenous-owned businesses and how these create opportunities for economic security and financial resilience for Indigenous peoples. She also shared her advice for Indigenous entrepreneurs moving forward. Hi, Susan. On behalf of Canadian SME, I'd like to welcome you to our Small Business Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Maheen. How are you?
I'm good. And I'm very pleased for you to be, joining us this afternoon and chatting with our Indigenous community members. Now, Susan, for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada, it is very difficult to access, financial services. And they often, don't qualify for loans or other types of assistance because their credit history, doesn't reflect areas where they had been in, where they've had trouble making ends meet as well. That leaves these communities very, very vulnerable. Now, can you share with our audience, what are the challenges? What are other challenges faced by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit assessing financial services in Canada?
Great, thanks, Maheen. And I am too very happy to have this conversation with you and your readers, especially your Indigenous readers. Before I answer your question, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. So in terms of the question, not unlike other entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses face, I would say, a challenge with respect to access. That's access to information, access to services, and access to capital. And so that's why I'm grateful to have this opportunity to have this discussion with you because, FedDev Ontario, Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario, is a fairly recent federal department created in response to the global economic crisis of 2008. And so at that time, it was really kind of responding to those economic challenges. Since then, over the last 13 years, we've really changed our programs and our services to better reflect the opportunities and challenges within Southern Ontario. And clearly we see that the growth of Indigenous companies is an area that we need to really, I think, do a better job of connecting with and making sure that Indigenous businesses are aware of FedDev Ontario. And so going back to, access to information. So I think we need to do a better job of making sure that Indigenous businesses know we're here and we are very much interested in supporting them. The Indigenous population in Canada is clearly an important part of our economy and our country, and that's true of Southern Ontario. So Southern Ontario has one of the largest Aboriginal Indigenous populations within Canada. It's about 15%, and that number is growing. And so I think there's a role for FedDev Ontario to really get out there and connect with Indigenous businesses. But I encourage your readers, those that are Indigenous entrepreneurs who are interested in kind of starting a new company or growing a new company, to reach out to us and find out what programs and services we offer. In getting ready for today's podcast, I looked at what have we been doing over the last few years? And, since 2018, I can tell you that we've invested in about 31 Indigenous projects, totaling about $28 million. And that's leveraged about $68 million. So, not a bad amount, but I think we can do better. And so hopefully today's podcast is, one of those things that we can do better, but we can't do it alone, Maheen. FedDev Ontario, like I said, is a new kind of, a new actor in this environment. And so we have to work with others, specifically Indigenous businesses, but others like the Aboriginal financial institutions, including two community future development corporations. So I think there's a role there. And, so access to information, in my opinion, often leads to better access to services, which then leads to better access to capital.
Absolutely. Now, you're right. When FedDev is committed to supporting the growth of Indigenous-owned businesses, and to support the growth, FedDev has in place various programs that offer financial and technical assistance that our audience will be very pleased to hear from you. So, Susan, what are some programs and business development offerings FedDev has in place for the growth of Indigenous-owned businesses in Canada?
Fantastic. A great segue for me to kind of talk about some of our programs. And I should say that Indigenous businesses can access any of our programs. And I should also mention that, we're open to First Nations, be they on or off reserve, Métis, or Inuit. And so it's really kind of, want to make sure that we're open and available to all Indigenous businesses within Southern Ontario. So in terms of our programs and services, I'm going to start off with our small business services. And this is a team within FedDev Ontario that really works with businesses, entrepreneurs and small businesses who are looking for information across the government. And so it's kind of a single source of information that you can contact them and get information. Their toll-free number is 1-888-576-4444. And, what's of interest, I think, to your readership is that they have they have all sorts of resources, including a resource for Indigenous entrepreneurs who want to start up a business. So that's one thing. I mentioned already that Indigenous businesses can access any of our programs, and our programs have changed over the years, really to kind of correspond to the economic opportunities and challenges within the region. And so right now, we've got a suite of programs that respond to the economic relief and recovery as a result of COVID-19. All of these are available to Indigenous businesses. However, again, going back to one of the other comments that I made, that, FedDev is really committed, as is the Government of Canada, to establish or to promote an inclusive economy. And so, there's 4 programs that we've recently launched that are more tailored to Indigenous businesses, in the sense that they have favorable terms or more favorable terms. And so I look at the Jobs and Growth Fund, which is one of those programs that we've launched to really help businesses in terms of economic recovery and resiliency. And so one of the priorities is inclusive growth. But even under that program, Indigenous businesses can access 100% support. And that's referred to as the stacking limit. And so unlike other non-Indigenous businesses, which are limited to normally 50%, Indigenous businesses will have more favorable terms. That's also true for 3 other programs that we've launched: the Tourism Relief Fund, the Aerospace Regional Recovery Initiative, and the Canada Community Revitalization Fund. With respect to the Tourism Relief Fund, I'd also say, Maheen, that Indigenous business not only have favorable terms in terms of the stacking limit, but we've actually set aside 10% of the funding specifically to support Indigenous businesses. So again, I really kind of, want to reach out and let Indigenous businesses in Southern Ontario know that, FedDev is here and we're open to working with them. Just to give you a sense of some of the projects that we have funded that I mentioned earlier about the 31 projects, it included working with the Aboriginal Financial Institution to create an Aboriginal Impact Capital, which is a loan to fund, and maybe I'll touch upon that a little bit later, as well as working with two of our community future development corporations, which are also considered Aboriginal financial institutions, and they provide loans exclusively to Indigenous businesses. So again, I think it's that part of our growth and our mandate to really look at how can FedDev really be part of the government and Canada's efforts to advance reconciliation, but more importantly, to recognize that Indigenous businesses are vital and important to our economy.
Absolutely. Now, Susan, what are your thoughts on how Indigenous peoples can, increase their ability to access funds for investment purposes, especially when it comes to, writing or producing art or owning a business or starting new businesses, right? So what is your thought on that?
I mentioned already reconciliation. As you look at the speeches from the thrones over the last few decades, never have I seen such a focus on, reconciling with Indigenous peoples, and not just reconciling in terms of, kind of social issues or land or whatever you have, but even from an economic perspective. So I really think there's an opportunity for Indigenous businesses to capitalize on kind of the current environment. I'd look at some of the stats. Indigenous businesses contribute over $30 billion to Canada's economy overall. So you can just imagine that this just makes good business sense. So what can Indigenous businesses do? Again, I would say to, an Indigenous business, if you're in Southern Ontario, look at some of the programs and services that FedDev Ontario offers. Look at, what the Aboriginal financial institutions offer. I think there's an opportunity for Indigenous businesses to expand from just starting companies, but really growing. And that's one of the challenges we face within Canadian businesses is once they've started a business, how do they grow it? And I think here again, there's this opportunity with, all of us recognizing we play a role to look at how we can support each other. I'll leave it there.
You're right. When you've mentioned so many various programs that FedDev has created to, help Indigenous owned businesses grow. Susan, how do your programs create opportunities for economic security and financial resilience for Indigenous people?
Great question. And I think that's so important in terms of, as we move forward, in terms of our relationship with Indigenous peoples. As an agency, I would say we have like three roles that we'd like to talk about. We work with businesses and others as a co-investor. And I talked a little bit about that in terms of the investments we made. But we also work as a champion and convener. And so there's a role for us to bring other organizations together to really kind of support our Indigenous businesses and our Indigenous communities together. And so that, if I may just talk a little bit about, kind of the Aboriginal Impact Capital that we did invest in, which is, it's a loan fund that involves 4 partners for Aboriginal financial institutions, the 2 community future development corporations, as well as the Métis Voyageur and agricultural, just looking at the proper agriculture program of Ontario, Indian Agricultural Program of Ontario. So together, the 4 organizations plus FED have created this loan fund really to support Indigenous businesses in terms of medium investments. We also recognize that Indigenous women are an important part of Indigenous businesses, and thankfully, through the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy, we partnered with the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association, NACA, to develop tools and resources, and we're actually piloting testing a proof of concept of a loan fund, a micro loan fund for Indigenous women in Southern Ontario. Again, so all of these programs are designed, Maheen, to not only just invest in terms of the profitability of companies. Certainly, we're interested in creating new jobs, good jobs for Indigenous peoples and others in Southern Ontario. But it's also an issue of sustainability and how can we make sure that we're not just, supporting business creation and growth, but looking at issues of productivity, looking at issues of community diversification. And we know that these are all very important values that Indigenous peoples hold as well. So, again, we've done some work. I think there's more work for us to do, but we certainly, really welcome the opportunity to work more closely with Indigenous partners and Indigenous businesses.
Right. Now, Susan, to be successful in business, it is not enough to have, good ideas or fresh approaches. You also need the correct mindset and approach. On a final note, what can you provide, your top 3 pieces of advice for Indigenous entrepreneurs?
First of all, Maheen, I have the utmost, admiration for anyone who starts a business. It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And so, I think your readers already have a good sense of what they need to do. But if I can just, offer some of the things that I've seen through my experience as, working for the government of Canada, working with businesses, is one, you have to have the right mindset. Go into this knowing that, we often hear about the overnight success because that makes good media. But often it's the entrepreneur working endlessly and tirelessly to get their business up and running. And so I would say make sure you do something that you love to do, because you're going to be doing it for a while. And so you really need to enjoy it. There's going to be hardships, but keep at it if you really believe in it. Secondly, I would say create a business plan. And we talked, early on about the importance of access to information. So, having that business plan, whatever you want to call it, business canvas model, just knowing where you want to go and how you're going to get there is critically important, because you never know who you're going to be sitting next to or meeting. And so they may always, you may encounter somebody who wants to invest in your business. And so if you're able to quickly articulate what you want to do and how you want to achieve it, you never know, you might have an angel right there looking at, investing in you. And thirdly, don't be afraid to ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you can't do it all your own. And so again, that's where FedDev, I think, can play a role in terms of supporting entrepreneurs and small businesses in terms of moving forward. And Maheen, if I didn't mention it before, I really do want to underline that, whether you're First Nation, on and off reserve, Métis and Inuit, on or off reserve in downtown Toronto, in a rural community, and everywhere in between, we're open to helping people out.
I'm really glad we had the chance to discuss the tools and resources available that FedUp is offering through various projects it do, and the benefits of working with Indigenous businesses and community, and how can we all together support them. Thank you so much for taking the time out of a very busy schedule, Susan, and for being so insightful. I think our audience would be pleased by hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Maheen. We really appreciate this opportunity to have the conversation with you.
Likewise, it was a pleasure having you with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Chatting with Susan was an amazing experience. Susan has worked across several regions in Canada through several departments and agencies dealing with a variety of complex policy issues, including regional economic development, community development, innovation, infrastructure, and Indigenous issues. FedUp Ontario delivers programs and services to support innovation and economic growth in Southern Ontario, Canada's most populous region. To learn more, visit their website, fedupontario.gc.ca. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Once again, we would like to thank our exclusive banking partner, RBC, and our exclusive shipping partner, UPS, for supporting this initiative. Please do share the podcast and feel free to check out the other episodes. And do not forget to subscribe to our Canadian SME Small Business Magazine to stay up to date on all our upcoming events and get the top business insights from industry leaders. This is your host, Maheen, for the Small Business Podcast.